There is a question that volcanologists have never been able to fully answer. And it is not a complicated question, it is actually a very simple one. Why are volcanoes round? Not approximately round. Not roughly circular. Precisely round. With a central opening at the top positioned at the exact geometric center of the structure, surrounded by walls that rise at consistent angles on all sides, producing a shape that, when viewed from above, is so geometrically regular that it appears designed rather than formed. The official answer is that lava flows outward equally in all directions from a central vent, producing a symmetrical cone shape through natural geological processes. And that explanation is reasonable. It accounts for the basic shape. But it does not account for everything. It does not account for the internal structure. It does not account for the chamber systems beneath the surface. It does not account for the energy output. And it does not account for something that researchers studying comparative architecture noticed when they began placing images of volcanic cross-sections next to cross-sections of certain old-world structures. The internal architecture of a volcano, the chamber system, the vent structure, the network of tunnels and passages that connect the surface opening to the energy source deep underground, matches, with a precision that is difficult to explain as coincidence, the internal architecture of specific old-world structures that appeared across the Tartarian civilization between approximately 1400 and 1800. Not approximately, not roughly. With a precision that suggests either an extraordinary coincidence or a connection that mainstream geology has never considered, because mainstream geology and alternative history have never been placed in the same conversation. Today we are going to place them in the same conversation. And what emerges from that conversation is a question that, once you hear it, is very difficult to stop thinking about. What if the volcanoes were not always volcanoes? What if what we are looking at, when we look at the internal structure of these geological formations, is not purely natural? What if some of what we call volcanoes are the remains of something that was built, something that was designed to do exactly what volcanoes do, access and release the energy stored in the Earth's interior, but designed by people, for people, as part of a system that powered a civilization? What if every volcano was once a Tartarian energy generator? Part 1. What we officially know about volcanoes. Let us start with the official science. Because the official science of volcanology is real, is documented, and contains within it several anomalies that the official science has never fully resolved. A volcano, in the standard geological definition, is an opening in the Earth's crust, through which molten rock, ash, and gases from the mantle below escape to the surface. The energy that drives volcanic activity comes from the heat of the Earth's interior, geothermal energy, produced by the radioactive decay of elements deep within the planet, and by the residual heat from the Earth's formation billions of years ago. That energy is real. It is enormous. The heat contained in the Earth's interior is estimated to be greater than all the energy stored in every coal and oil and gas deposit on the planet combined, by orders of magnitude. The Earth is essentially a heat engine of almost incomprehensible scale, and volcanoes are, in the standard geological model, the places where that energy reaches the surface. Now, here is the first anomaly. The distribution of volcanoes on the Earth's surface is not random. Geologists know this. There are specific zones of high volcanic activity, the Ring of Fire around the Pacific, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the East African Rift, and these zones correspond to the boundaries between tectonic plates. Where plates meet and separate and collide, the crust is thin enough for the interior heat to escape. This is the standard explanation for why volcanoes are where they are. But within those zones, the placement of individual volcanoes is not fully explained by plate tectonics alone. Specific volcanoes appear at specific locations, with specific characteristics, that the broad pattern of plate boundaries does not fully account for. Hotspots, places where volcanic activity occurs in the middle of tectonic plates, far from any boundary, are acknowledged by mainstream geology as real phenomena, but their precise locations and the regularity of their spacing have never been fully explained. If you map the locations of major volcanic hotspots globally, something interesting appears. They are not randomly distributed. They fall at intervals that, when measured, show a degree of regularity that pure geological randomness does not produce. Not perfectly regular, but significantly more regular than chance alone would create. Someone looking at that distribution without the assumption that it must be purely natural might ask a different question than volcanologists typically ask. Not what geological process produced this distribution, but whether the distribution was, at some point, the result of something other than purely natural geological processes. Part 2. The internal architecture. Now let us look at what is inside a volcano. Because the interior of a volcanic system is where the architectural comparison becomes impossible to ignore. A standard volcanic system has the following components: a magma chamber deep underground, a reservoir where molten rock accumulates before an eruption, a main conduit connecting the magma chamber to the surface, a vertical or near-vertical channel through which the magma travels upward, a central vent at the surface, the opening through which material is expelled, and a network of secondary conduits, smaller channels branching off the main conduit that connect to secondary vents on the flanks of the volcano. That is the official geological description, and it is accurate as far as it goes. Now look at the internal architecture of the large Tartarian towers, the ones that have been partially analyzed by researchers studying Old World construction. The ones whose foundations go significantly deeper than structural requirements would explain. The ones built with materials that show electromagnetic properties. The ones that disappeared from city rooftops between 1920 and 1940 when the centralized electrical grid was installed. Those towers had the following internal components: a deep underground chamber at the base, significantly deeper than any structural foundation requirement would explain, lined with specific materials designed to accumulate and concentrate energy. A central vertical conduit connecting the underground chamber to the above-ground structure, the primary channel through which the accumulated energy traveled upward, a surface aperture at the top of the tower, the opening through which the energy was released or transmitted, and a network of secondary conduits branching from the main vertical channel, smaller channels that connected to secondary output points at specific intervals along the tower's height, magma chamber, underground energy reservoir, main conduit, vertical energy channel, central vent, surface output aperture, secondary conduits, secondary output channels. The structural description of a volcanic system and the structural description of a Tartarian energy tower are, component by component, the same description. The same architecture, the same system. One described in geological terms, the other described in engineering terms. The difference is what flows through the conduits. In the geological description, it is molten rock. In the engineering description, it is electromagnetic energy. But here is the question that this comparison raises. What if the distinction between those two things, molten rock and electromagnetic energy, is less clear than we assume? What if the same geological process that produces volcanic activity is also capable of producing the kind of electromagnetic energy that Tesla was working with in Colorado Springs in 1899? What if the Earth's internal heat engine produces not just thermal energy, but electromagnetic energy simultaneously? And what if someone, at some point in history, understood that and built systems to access both? Part 3. The energy output. Volcanoes produce energy. Enormous amounts of energy. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens released energy equivalent to 1,600 atomic bombs in a matter of seconds. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora released so much energy that it changed the global climate for a year, producing 1816, the year without a summer, when temperatures dropped worldwide, harvests failed across Europe and North America, and famine followed. That is the destructive output, what volcanologists measure and document. But volcanoes also produce something else that receives significantly less attention in standard geological literature. They produce electromagnetic anomalies. In the period before, during, and after volcanic eruptions, sensitive instruments detect unusual electromagnetic activity around the volcano. Radio frequency emissions, magnetic field distortions, electrical discharges, not just the dramatic lightning that appears in photographs of erupting volcanoes, but lower-level, sustained electromagnetic activity that persists between eruption events. The official explanation for this electromagnetic activity is that it is a byproduct of the mechanical stress on rock as magma moves through the conduit system. Piezoelectric effects, the electrical charge produced when certain types of rock are put under mechanical pressure. A natural and well-documented physical phenomenon. That explanation is scientifically valid. Piezoelectric effects are real. But it does not explain the scale of the electromagnetic output detected around certain volcanoes. It does not explain why some volcanic systems produce dramatically more electromagnetic activity than their eruption frequency or intensity would suggest. And it does not explain why the electromagnetic output of certain volcanoes, when mapped spatially, appears to radiate outward from the central vent in patterns that look less like natural diffusion and more like directed transmission, like something sending a signal or distributing energy outward from a central point, in a pattern that someone who understood electromagnetic principles might design intentionally. Part 4. The timing. Here is where the historical record enters the picture, and where the timeline produces its most uncomfortable question. The Tartarian civilization, the one that appears on maps through approximately 1780 and then disappears, was centered in a geographic territory that has an unusual concentration of volcanic activity. The Ural region, Siberia, Central Asia, the area stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific coast of Russia. This is not a volcanic hotspot in the dramatic ring of fire sense. There are no major active stratovolcanoes in the center of the Tartarian territory, comparable to Vesuvius or Fuji. But there is a significant concentration of geothermal activity, hot springs, geothermal vents, low-level volcanic features that indicate the Earth's internal heat is closer to the surface in this region than in many other parts of the world. The people who built the Tartarian civilization, who constructed those extraordinary buildings with their deep foundations and electromagnetic towers, were living above one of the most geothermally active continental regions on Earth. They had, for generations, access to the visible and tangible evidence that the Earth produces energy, that heat and force emerge from the ground at specific locations, that there is something beneath the surface that can be accessed. And the towers they built, the ones whose internal architecture matches the internal architecture of volcanic systems, were concentrated in the cities of this geothermally active region, not randomly distributed across their territory, concentrated where the Earth's energy was closest to the surface. Now look at what happened to that territory between 1800 and 1850. The Tartarian reset. The unexplained population collapses. The buildings that were standing in the 1790s and are recorded as ruins by the 1830s. And look at what happened to the volcanic and geothermal activity in the same region during the same period, because the early 1800s produced something in the volcanic record that geologists have documented but not fully explained. A period of unusual global volcanic activity, multiple major eruptions in rapid succession. Tambora in 1815. Increased activity across multiple volcanic systems simultaneously. The standard geological explanation is natural variability in the volcanic cycle. Eruptions cluster because geological processes cluster. A reasonable explanation. But the clustering happened at the same time as the Tartarian reset, at the same time as the unexplained population collapses, at the same time as the buildings went from standing to ruined with no documented cause. What if the energy generators were not destroyed from outside? What if they failed from within? What if the system that the Tartarian civilization had built to access and distribute the Earth's geothermal energy, the towers, the deep foundations, the conduit systems that mirrored volcanic architecture, catastrophically failed? What if the failure of that system released the energy it had been managing in an uncontrolled way? What if the volcanoes of the early 1800s were not natural geological events, but the uncontrolled release of energy from a failed human system? Part 5. The mountains that were not always mountains. There is a hypothesis that exists at the edge of mainstream geological discussion and has never been fully incorporated into the standard narrative. It concerns the formation of certain mountain ranges and volcanic structures and asks a question that pure geology struggles to answer. Some mountains and volcanic structures show evidence of having been modified. Not created from nothing by human hands, the geological origin of the underlying rock formations is genuine. But the final shape, the specific configuration, the geometric regularity of certain peaks and crater systems, those show evidence of intervention that natural geological processes do not fully account for. The most dramatic examples are the flat-topped mountains, the mesas and table mountains found across multiple continents. Geological explanation for flat-topped mountains involves differential erosion, harder rock on top protecting softer rock below from erosion, producing a flat summit surrounded by vertical walls. And that process is real. It does produce flat-topped mountains. But the precision of the flatness in certain cases exceeds what differential erosion typically produces. The perfectly level summits, the vertical walls at precise angles, the regular dimensions. These features, in certain flat-topped mountains around the world, are more consistent with what you would expect if the natural geological formation had been further modified, leveled, shaped, prepared for a specific purpose, by people with the engineering capability to work at that scale. If the Tartarian civilization had the engineering capability to build the structures we see in historical photographs, the grand institutional buildings, the deep foundation systems, the electromagnetic towers, they had the engineering capability to work with existing geological formations. To take a geothermal vent, already producing the energy they wanted to access, and modify the structure around it. To shape the crater. To regularize the conduit. To turn a natural geological feature into a more efficient, more controllable, more directable energy system. Not to build a volcano from nothing, but to take what the Earth had already produced and make it work better. The volcanoes would still be volcanoes, still geological, still natural in origin, but modified, engineered, turned from a raw geological feature into a functional energy system by people who understood what they were working with. And when those people disappeared, when the Tartarian reset erased the civilization that had been managing those systems, the modified features would remain. But without management, without control, without the human understanding that had been directing and distributing the energy output in a controlled way. What happens when you remove human management from an engineered energy system and leave it running without control? It fails, eventually, sometimes catastrophically. Part 6. What the craters show. Let us look at volcanic craters specifically. Because the crater, the opening at the top of a volcanic structure, is where the architectural comparison is most precise and most difficult to explain as coincidence. Volcanic craters are round, precisely round, with a central opening at the exact geometric center, surrounded by walls that rise at consistent angles. When you look directly down into a volcanic crater from above, you see a circle, a perfect circle, with a dark central opening at its center. Now look at the aperture design of the Tartarian towers, the opening at the top of each tower through which electromagnetic energy was transmitted. Round, precisely round, with a central opening at the exact geometric center, surrounded by a structure that rises at consistent angles from the main tower body to the apex. When you look directly down at the top of a Tartarian tower from above, you see a circle, with a central opening at its center. The proportional relationship between the diameter of the opening and the diameter of the surrounding structure, in both cases, falls within the same mathematical range, not approximately, within the same range. This could be coincidence. Nature produces circles frequently. Human designers produce circles frequently. Two circular structures existing independently is not, by itself, evidence of connection. But it is not just the circles. It is the entire system beneath the circles that is identical. The chamber below, the conduit between, the output at the top, and the distribution pattern of the energy released, radiating outward from the central point in patterns that look, in both cases, like directed transmission rather than random diffusion. When every component of a system matches every component of another system, not just the visible external shape, but the internal architecture, the energy behavior, the distribution patterns, and the geographic placement, coincidence becomes an increasingly insufficient explanation. Part 7. What happened to the system? Here is the final piece. And it is the piece that ties the volcanic evidence to the broader pattern we have been examining across multiple videos. The Tartarian energy system, if it existed as the evidence suggests, was not a small, localized system. It was global. The towers appeared on every continent. The geographic distribution of those towers, when mapped, shows the same regularity that we noted in the distribution of volcanic hotspots. The same spacing. The same placement at intervals that pure randomness does not produce. A global system, accessing geothermal energy at specific points across the Earth's surface, distributing that energy through a network of towers, available to every city, every building, every person connected to the infrastructure. Not metered, not billed, not controlled by any single entity. And then, between 1800 and 1850, that system failed, or was deliberately shut down. The Tartarian reset erased the civilization that had been managing it. The towers were eventually removed from the buildings they stood on. The centralized electrical grid replaced whatever the towers had been distributing, and the geothermal access points, the modified volcanic structures, the engineered craters, the conduit systems that had been directing and controlling the Earth's interior energy, were left without management. Some of them went quiet, became dormant. The geothermal activity continued beneath them, but without the directional management that had been shaping its output, it no longer reached the surface in a controlled way. Some of them failed catastrophically. The early 1800s cluster of major volcanic eruptions, Tambora, and the elevated global volcanic activity of that period may represent the uncontrolled release of energy from systems that had lost their management. And some of them, the ones that were too deep, too large, too fundamentally geological to be shut down, continued operating, as they had always operated since before the Tartarian civilization modified them, as natural geological features producing natural geological outputs, but not entirely natural, not entirely unmodified, because the modifications remain in the geometric precision of certain craters, in the regularity of certain conduit systems, in the electromagnetic output patterns that do not quite match what purely natural volcanic activity should produce. The generators are still running, without management, without control, without the civilization that understood what they were and how to use them. We call them volcanoes. We study them as geology. We measure their thermal output and their seismic signatures and their electromagnetic anomalies, and we explain all of it in purely natural terms. But the architecture is there, in the chambers and the conduits and the craters, in the proportions and the spacing and the distribution patterns, in the electromagnetic output that behaves less like natural diffusion and more like directed transmission, the architecture of something that was built, modified, managed, and then abandoned. We started this video with a simple question. Why are volcanoes round? The geological answer is real. Lava flows outward equally from a central vent. Natural processes produce symmetrical shapes. The science is valid. But the science does not fully explain what we find when we look at the complete picture. The internal architecture that matches Tartarian tower design component by component, the electromagnetic output patterns that look more like transmission than diffusion, the geographic distribution that is more regular than pure geological randomness produces, the timing of the major volcanic events of the early 1800s that coincides precisely with the Tartarian reset, and the modifications visible in certain volcanic structures that exceed what natural geological processes alone account for. We are not telling you that every volcano was built by human hands. The geological origin of volcanic systems is real and documented and not in question. We are asking whether some of what we call natural volcanic activity is, or was, something more than purely natural. Whether the civilization that built electromagnetic towers on every institutional building across the old world, that understood how to access and distribute the Earth's geothermal energy through engineered conduit systems, whether that civilization found the places where the Earth's energy was closest to the surface and modified what was already there to make it work better, and whether what we see today, when we look at certain volcanic structures, is not just geology, but geology plus engineering, nature plus modification, a natural feature that was once a managed system, still running, 2 centuries after the people who managed it disappeared. The volcanoes are still there. The chambers and the conduits and the craters are still there. The electromagnetic output is still there. And the architecture, if you know what you are looking for, is still there too. Subscribe. Because next time we are going to look at specific volcanic structures around the world whose features do not match standard geological models, and compare them, side by side, with documented Tartarian construction techniques. The comparison is something that once you see it, you cannot unsee. The generators are still running. We just forgot what they were.